Okay, cool. So we're now recording. And yeah, just to reiterate that the history of this land starts with the Kamiltpa people of the now the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakama Nation. And I can't represent their story, but the story that I can represent is that of Sacred Earth Foundation and the history of Oconee Ranch as we now know this land. So I'm going to do a little screen share here. Starting with a little bit of beauty. Many of us have named spots along Rock Creek in our introductions um, as being a special place to us. And the land that Sacred Earth Foundation takes care of is all along the Rock Creek watershed. So before we get into the maps, I thought I'd show a pretty picture of the landscape that has captured so many of our hearts and that we have so many memories and such a strong connection to. This is a pano from the Rainbow Springs overlook, which I'll show you on the map. So I'm going to get into the larger landscape and then we'll talk about the history of the land trust and then we'll talk a bit about what's coming up organizationally and what the future of land conservation work at Oconee is. So, and the bigger picture of the organization is we conserve the land by largely by owning it and by creating a strong neighborhood and relationships with conservation-oriented neighbors. And then we steward the land, involving a lot of forestry work and care, active care of the land. And we share it with many hundreds, often thousands of people a year with an emphasis on children, but people of all ages, of course. So today we're going to talk about the conserve part of our mission, the part where we protect the land by conserving it permanently. So this is the larger landscape of Rock Creek, the Rock Creek watershed, showing Sacred Earth Foundation in orange, um, and other folks that are invested in the Rock Creek watershed. So it runs from the Simcoe Mountains, which is shown up here at the, or is about at the northern extent of the map, and then Rock Creek runs down to the Columbia River. And I've gotten just so much more appreciative as time has gone on about the importance of the Rock Creek watershed and being a north-south habitat corridor between the Columbia River and the Simcoe Mountains, connecting the interior of Washington State culturally and geographically and habitat-wise to the Columbia River, which is, of course, the big watershed of the area. The Klickitat River is a bigger watershed and a bigger river, but Rock Creek is the other north-south connector between the mountains and the river. So Sacred Earth Foundation is this orange, and then in gray is the Bureau of Land Management. So we've got some federal land in there. Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife is this dark green. Yakama Nation owns land throughout the watershed with a real focus here on the lower section of the watershed. Their longhouse is in this stretch of the watershed. The Nature Conservancy has a little bit of land in the watershed. Some of it is owned outright, and some of it they hold conservation easements on. The Department of Natural Resources has a little section in here. Western Pacific Timber has a whole bunch of land in here. All of this land that Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife owns was at one point owned by Western Pacific Timber. And then Washington State Parks. This is Brooks Memorial State Park, if you're familiar with that park on Highway 97. So that's kind of the bigger landscape of the watershed that we're working with here. Okay, moving on to cute picture of Ray and friends who bought the original 160-acre parcel in 1972. So here's Ray on the left as a young guy. This was the oldest picture that I could find of Ray. If anybody does know who these buddies of Ray's are in this picture, I'd love to know their names because this long predates me. And I'd love to know who these guys are, but this is Ray and friends around the time that Ray bought bought the original 160-acre parcel that is now the Oconee Valley, where the lodges and all of the camp facilities and everything. So he was a back to the lander in the early 70s, looking for land in the Columbia Gorge area. He came from the Washington metro area and really loved the Columbia Gorge area and wanted to have land out of the city and out in this neck of the woods. And every one of these parcels that we'll talk about has so many stories behind it. I'm not going to be able to get into all of the storytelling today because there's so much to every one of these pieces of land, just layers and layers of stories. The original Oconee 160-acre parcel, the story that I've heard about it is that Ray bumped into somebody in a bar in Goldendale when he was shopping for land out here who told him about this property, and they came out here and kind of talked the previous owners into selling it to them. It wasn't even really on the market. But they really loved this land so much that they retained this little 1 acre corner of the property so that they could keep a little tiny bit of this land out here. That was in an area pre-zoning where you could carve off just one single acre. You couldn't do that now. And then in the mid 80s, timber prices were high and land was getting logged and developed all over the area. And by that time, Ray had been here for what, 14, 15 years and had fallen deeply in love with this landscape and had ridden horses and hiked all over the whole area between Rock Creek and Mount Adams and up into the Simcoes and knew this landscape so well. And he just could not handle the logging and development that was happening around the region. So he set out with some friends and allies who also loved this place and were good friends of Ray's and really believed in his vision to protect this landscape. He set out to start the Sacred Earth Foundation Land Trust as a land holding mechanism to help protect this landscape. And this canyon parcel was the first property that came into the Sacred Earth Foundation Land Trust after it was started in 1986. Land Trust in 1986 and their first purchase in 1987. Also in 1986, Ray started the summer camp program partially as a way to fund land acquisition and make it possible for Ray to stay on the property and not have to leave as he had been doing to make money to make land payments and fund his life at the ranch. The summer camp was partially a way to protect, or originally envisioned as a way to protect more land and and um, and take care of it and make it possible for him to stay home and take care of the land and share it with people too. So then in 1994, so there was a period of years where not much happened with the land trust actively, and then two properties came in 1994. 1994 was actually the first year that I came to summer camp, and this is kind of where the stories that I know something about personally came into the mix. I remember Ray talking about this Wagner Springs property, and I met the folks that helped buy this property. And at this time, this was before Sacred Earth Foundation was a 501c3 nonprofit. And so the people who were giving money to help Ray buy land were not getting a tax deduction or anything. They were just doing it because they came out here, they fell in love with this place, they believed in Ray's vision to care for this place, and they believed that he would be a good steward of this land. And so they invested in the future of land protection in this area. And then
So, Shoni, do you want to know some of the history of that property?
I would love to come back around to that. I want to finish going through these slides, and then I'm going to save time for questions and more comments. And I do want to say that if anybody on the call, I know there's a few people who have really long history with Oconee and Sacred Earth Foundation and probably hold a lot of the stories of these different properties. And I would love to have like a whole conversation to fill out my knowledge of the land and as it has become part of SEF. If we get into all of the storytelling tonight, I'm not going to be able to get to the next steps that I also want to cover in this. So I want to get all the way through my slides, and then we'll see how much time we have for sharing more stories and asking more questions, if that's okay.
That's okay, but what I have to say directly relates to the conservation history of Oconee. So
Okay, Jeff, go
we
ahead.
can come back to it.
But no, go ahead.
Well, that property from the previous slide,
Mm-hmm.
on the what you're calling the up drainage.
Yep.
So that was a time when the timber prices were spiking as well.
Yep.
And Ray was all freaked out about it. And I had just recently come into the Oconee scene. So I gave him the money to buy a couple of those parcels up there.
Thank
Um,
you.
and at the time, he was still freaked out about what was going on, but pardon me if maybe I'm, being a little bit jocular about this, but at the time, he didn't quite know what to do with the land. And he was more in the mode of old hippie, let's not touch a limb on a sacred tree kind of approach. And I suggested that if he wanted to buy more land, that what he could do would be take the parcels that he had just bought, and instead of because they were going to be clear cut, if somebody else bought them, and I said selectively log those to raise money, and at the same time selectively log parts of the rest of your property to raise more money to buy more property. And so that's when he sort of turned his head around and said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And he started down that track at that time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good piece of the puzzle here. And that was part of how Ray was able to accomplish some of these next acquisitions in the future as well. So in 2000, all this land came into the land trust through a variety of different sort of ways. The Loping Stretch was this 40-acre parcel up here, and then all of these properties down along Ownby Road and out towards Rainbow Springs. So the first picture that I showed y'all was taken from about this vantage overlooking Rock Creek on this, what was a 160-acre Rainbow Springs property, and which was at that time owned by a dear friend of Ray's and Sacred Earth Foundation. And then all of these properties here came into the foundation in 2000, as well as the Loping Stretch property. And then in 2003, these properties here, the Heavenly Heights properties, which is where there's a whole ranch associated homestead. That's where my home is, and Jenna and Sean, and a bunch of our horse corrals, and there's a whole bunch of infrastructure up here that has been really important to the ranch, came in at 2003. And then in 2006, well, 2006 and 2007 was the last acquisition that Ray did during his life with the help of friends, including Jeff, and some careful, thoughtful, selective harvest of some timber on Oconee land, was able to fund the acquisition of Bear Hollow and the Brady property. And the primary timber harvest that he did to fund those, to ultimately fund those properties, was hops poles, which I think was a really interesting commercial venture for SEF, because that was thinning some of the smaller overcrowded timber on the property, and in the Yakima Valley, which seemed like just such a win-win for the land to help protect this property, and thin the forest that is significantly overstocked in some areas, and raise money for this property in a way that was good for the land. And then the Loping corner, I'm not quite sure, and maybe Jeff, and we could talk later about this, why these two properties closed in 2006, and then this one, the records don't show until 2007. But this was the last property that came into Sacred Earth Foundation during Ray's life.
I was not involved with that last one. With the previous one, basically, I didn't give him the money to do that. I lent him the money at the time, and he paid me back later. In fact, not long before he died. he
Mhm.
paid me back for that piece. So the last one, I was not involved in that, so I don't know what happened.
And then, of course, Ray died in 2007. That was a very shocking event for the land trust. He was a really strong, vibrant, healthy person and died very suddenly and left the land in big question about what stewardship was going to look like going forward. And of course, the organization went through some pretty big changes at that time and involved pausing land acquisitions for about a decade. We just did not have the capacity to do land transactions during that decade while the organization was recovering from Ray's death. And then in 2017, we got back into the land conservation business with the first acquisition at Rainbow Springs. So Rainbow Springs was a 160-acre parcel here. Two friends had bought it and split it into two 80-acre parcels, and then we eventually were able to buy 73 acres of that from one of those friends. So that was the first big land deal that we did after Ray's death. And Rainbow Springs has been just quite a puzzle ever since then. It was only a couple of years after Ray died that the friend that owned that property alerted us that he needed to sell it, and we've been working on it kind of ever since. And it's not quite over yet, but we're getting close. And then in 2018, real estate really picked up. This property, the Aspen Grove, is within line of sight from the main ranch. It's just across the horse pasture there. Really important property. We put out the word to Oconee Friends that that one was at risk, and a friend came out of the woodworks and bought it and donated it to SEF. That was the first time a miracle like that had happened on my watch, and it was quite an amazing thing. Ever grateful to Dale Plank for the protection of this 20-acre parcel that is just a really phenomenal habitat with western gray squirrel habitat, and the Oconee Creek runs right through it, and it's just a really important property. And then the Gateway 5 acres we had to buy to secure our road easement into the Oconee Valley when we improved the road to bring the ranch facilities up to code. And then the Fir Forest property came up for sale right around that same time, and we had just exactly the right amount of money in our conservation fund at the time that we had just launched to buy that property. So we took it as a sign and we just went ahead and bought that property when it came up for sale. And that was just an amazing thing to be able to just go ahead and buy property when it came up for sale. And then also in that same year, we sold the Hacienda property, which was the first time that SEF has ever sold a property. But this was a homestead that was no longer serving the ranch well. My parents actually had lived there, and they bought property over closer to the main ranch. And the organization decided to sell it because we didn't have the capacity to maintain it. And that was also the same time that we were launching the Saddle Up Capital campaign, and we needed some funds to kickstart that giant and essential project for the ranch. So we sold that 40-acre property to a nice young family who lives there still. And then in 2021, this is the most recent acquisitions that we have done organizationally. The far section of Rainbow Springs was donated to SEF. 70 acres of it was donated for a tax-deductible donation from the folks that had originally bought 80 acres of it. They donated the 70 acres and then sold 10 acres to a good friend of Oconee. And then around the same time, I got an accidental phone call from the owner of what was an 80-acre parcel here. He called me inadvertently intending to contact his logger, and that launched a whole conversation about what his intentions were on this property that resulted in Oconee buying the property, buying 55 acres of the property instead of him logging the entire property, which would have been a real disaster for the land, for the adjacent land, and for the cemetery grounds, which is right about here. And we took out a private loan from a good friend of Oconee to do that we're still paying off. That we went way out on a limb to buy that property, but it was really an essential acquisition for the protection of that part of the landscape. So this is what Sacred Earth Foundation land looks like now. This is the current map of land that is held by SEF. You can see there's a bit of a gap. We're going to talk about that in a second. And you can also see where the cemetery lies in here as well. That's the White Eagle Memorial Preserve Green Cemetery. This map also illustrates friends of SEF who are associated with SEF, who basically bought land adjacent to Oconee because they're related to Oconee and they love the organization, love the landscape, and want to be good neighbors and partners in conservation. And so we've got just a growing number of great neighbors around the perimeter of SEF land, and that has become an increasing priority organizationally to not necessarily own all of the land, but to have neighbors in conservation and collaboration and taking care of this landscape. And then this map I threw in here to illustrate the parcelization of the larger neighborhood. When Ray first bought 160 acres out here, he was one of 3 households on all of Old Mountain Road. This is Old Mountain Road that comes off of Bickleton Road here. And there was only 3 households out here. And now this whole, and he used to ride all over this whole neighborhood. And now the neighborhood is just stacked with 5 and 10 and 20 acre parcels all through the whole neighborhood. And it wasn't until I really zoomed out one day and looked at the whole map of the whole neighborhood that I really appreciated what Ray and Sacred Earth Foundation had done to create a buffer of protection along Upper Rock Creek, the Upper Rock Creek watershed. This is the most accessible part of the watershed. The lower part of the watershed is lots of very large ranches and lots of state land and lots of tribal land where it's already in bigger sections. And this part of the neighborhood has the easiest road access and therefore is becoming the most parcelized. And SEF has just done a phenomenal job of holding that kind of development off of the upper section of Rock Creek and off of this tributary to Rock Creek, the Oconee Creek drainage that runs right by the lodge and down through the majority of SEF land and down into Rock Creek, which has been identified as our priority area. So this map illustrates the priorities of SEF for protection, just recognizing that we're a small organization and we can't do everything. And we have to really prioritize our work organizationally so that we don't get spread too thin. So we've really carefully articulated the Tier 1 priorities, the properties that we're the most interested in protecting for Sacred Earth Foundation. And that's this green color. So we've got this section that's Tier 1 right along Oconee Creek into where it goes into Rock Creek. And then this one outlier up here, which is the rest of that 80-acre parcel that we bought 55 acres of in 2021. We would sure love to pick up the rest of it someday when conditions allow for that. But as of this time, that owner is not ready to let go of it. And so hopefully someday we'll be able to do that. And then this map also, well, and then Tier 2 priorities are further up Rock Creek and then further up in the Oconee Creek headwaters is what we've identified as Tier 2 priorities. And then Tier 3 priorities is basically just the rest of the neighborhood. Like, wouldn't it be nice if SEF could protect this whole landscape at some point in the future? But we do have to have some sense of our priorities. And then this map also identifies friends of SEF. It's a little bit outdated at this point. A couple of these yellow parcels have turned blue in the subsequent years since this was made. But we're also stacking the neighborhood with friends of Oconee. Now I'm going to look at these 4 parcels here, which is a project that we're currently working on that you're likely to hear more about in the coming weeks, months, over the next year or so. These 4 20-acre parcels were owned by a dear friend of SEF and a good associated neighbor who bought land out here because they'd met Ray and went out to Rock Creek and fell in love with the land, as so many of us do. And then they bought this first 20-acre parcel up here and then gradually added these other 3 parcels over the years as they went up for sale. Those friends both died over the past 4 years or so, and both of them now are buried out of the White Eagle Cemetery, and the land has passed to their family, and we're in active communication with the family about the possibility of protecting this land for the long run. Which is kind of every land project is its whole own movie. Every real estate transaction, as any of you have ever done a real estate transaction would know, every real estate transaction is its whole own set of legal shenanigans and fine print and diplomacy and communication and trying to figure out what the best thing for this land is nothing different. Every land transaction is its whole own project. So we're currently engaged in this project trying to find the best solution for it. And this is another view of that property. And maybe this is my last slide, but we are potentially going to be in a position in the coming months or years to be looking for more good neighbors to SEF, which could involve these properties or could involve other adjacent properties around the perimeter of the land trust. Of course, we really would like for these 4 properties to come into Sacred Earth Foundation in the near term or the long term. They're really important for the connectivity of the habitat between this section of Oconee and this section of Oconee, and maintaining our access for our programs and riding and trails and hikes and all the things that we do with our programs to share this land, maintaining accessibility down Harbison Road and out to Rainbow Springs, and also creating some buffer around the really high priority Oconee Creek ecosystem. And then the other properties that I just wanted to flag were that these 2 properties here, these 2 20-acre parcels, changed hands in 2020, like in late spring, early summer 2020, which, if you remember, was a global pandemic. And we were also in the midst of a $2 million capital campaign. And when I saw the signs go up on Harbison Road and saw that these 2 properties were coming up for sale, I saw those signs and I thought about the situation that we were in, and I thought about the pandemic, and I thought about the capital campaign, and I looked away from those signs and figured that we just did not have the capacity to do that at that time. And since then, both of those properties changed hands. One of them is getting used pretty hard by the family that's trying to make a go homesteading it. We've had some problems with ATV driving and trespassing across Oconee land to get out to state land because of these 2 properties. And I learned a pretty hard lesson about looking away from property when it goes up for sale. Like, we only get one chance in a generation sometimes to interrupt the cycle of like exploitation of land and to protect land permanently. So now my attitude is that I'll just turn over every stone trying to figure out how to protect land when we have an opportunity to. And at the same time, we have to recognize that we're like a small organization with limited capacity. We don't have the capacity to do everything that we possibly want to, and so we have to be strategic about partnering with others where we can too. So we're working on a solution for these, and we may be putting out the word to Friends of Oconee over the coming months and years, seeking some good neighbors and allies and partners and supporters in conservation of this part of the watershed, and just wanting to have a deeper pool of people who are interested in helping with this work and potentially being neighbors of Oconee and partnering in conservation of this watershed over the years. So let me just see if that was for the last Zoom. We'll stay on this one here. So let me just double check my little, like, is this the stuff that I wanted to talk about? The tools for conservation that we use as an organization, we use purchase of land outright, organizationally. We don't work much or at all with conservation easements, as many land trusts do, for reasons involving the value of land in this region and the legality and nuance of defending conservation easements. We've decided we don't want to engage with as an organization. We also conserve land by partnering with neighbors who want to help protect the land. And in some circumstances, we conserve land by engaging with bridge buyers who may be in a position to acquire land, who have the capital to acquire land in a time efficient fashion, because sometimes real estate moves quickly, and then work with us to find an ultimate good solution for that land in partnership with SEF. So those are some of the tools that we've brought to bear so far. We've done a certain amount of engaging in debt to take on land. We're currently working to pay off this 55 acres that we bought to prevent it from being logged in 2021. We bought we bought 73 acres of the Rainbow Springs complex on a contract that we just finished paying off last year. We've done a little bit of that, but we don't love being in debt as an organization. So we're trying not to get into too much of that, not to go too far out on those limbs. So there's just so many stories involved in every single one of these properties, and not just the real estate transactions, but also just the beauty of those places and the experiences and encounters that we've had there. Every one of the places that you all named in the introductions are like real places on this map that have layers of stories and experiences and cool things that have happened out there. So many kids have had so many experiences out there. But that is kind of the quickest, most abbreviated way that I can tell the story of these maps. And I do want to save some time for some questions. And I think that some have popped up into the chat too, but I'll stop the share for now, and I can pop back into any of those maps if anybody wants to ask a question that has to do with one of the maps. So that's your quick tour. And okay, I'm just gonna go through some of the comments here. Oh, we got a beautiful picture from Sarah of camas blooming in a meadow by the kitchen. There's camas that bloomed this year like 3 feet from the patio of the new kitchen, which I was so pleased to see that we still had. I mean, even after all the construction disruption to that meadow and to that habitat, we still have camas that's blooming like right outside the front door of the Yummy Tummy. And Jake is showing, oh, the view from our burial site is in the chat. That is so beautiful. And then Susan just reminding me that it's Q&A time and that I should stop and open it to questions. So unmute yourself and pop in with questions, or raise your hand in whatever way you can, or pop your questions into the chat. Any of those will work. We'll keep an eye on all of you. Paul, it looks like you unmuted. Did you unmute because you wanted to?
Well, yeah, I was
type
trying
in?
to find the raise hand button that's moved
You
around
got it.
when I last did that.
I got your inquisitive look.
From a practical perspective, I mean, what is those 20-acre pieces that are kind of some of your priority one, that little one up there in the corner? They may not be available now, but what are they running on a 20-acre parcel? Is there a wide variety based on how many harvestable trees are in there versus they've already been harvested 30 years ago, so there's not as much? Is there
It's a very wide variety. The realtor that I spoke with most recently is saying that 20-acre parcels in this area are running anywhere from like 75,000 for a 20-acre parcel to maybe 150 or even 200, depending on what's on it. But for raw land, we're looking 75 to 120 or so for a 20-acre parcel for raw land, really depending on whether it's treed, whether it has a view, how beautiful it is, what the road access is, how close it is to power lines, whether there are good wells in the neighborhood. Of course, if there's a well on it or a road access right to it, or power lines right nearby, that would increase the value of property significantly. So it really depends on the individual parcel, but that's kind of the range that
So
we're
some of the stuff that's more landlocked and surrounded with little limited access and limited water or power is a lot easier to come by in theory, but interesting. Okay, so it's not millions of dollars. I'm just trying to figure out what this.
It's not millions of dollars, and that's part of why we have decided organizationally not to engage in conservation easements, because the expense and hassle and liability of imposing conservation easements on this ground would be not worth it, because the ground is not that expensive to begin with. If you're talking wetlands right next to Portland city limits that would otherwise be worth, $4 million or something, a conservation easement makes a lot of sense because you can protect that land without owning it outright. In this part of the world, it makes more sense for our organization to own the land outright than to get into conservation easements. Many land trusts work heavily in conservation easements, and we are a land trust that has decided not to do that strategically so far. That could change in the future, but so far that's our decision.
Hey,
Jeff.
Tony, just for historical perspective, I think
Great.
those 220s up the creek from the ranch that we bought at the start of that whole thing, I want to say that it was $20,000 for all of it, but maybe it was maybe it was 20 each.
Yeah.
And then the cemetery land, that was an 80, wasn't it? Was that an 80-acre piece when he bought it?
The cemetery goes across several parcels.
Yeah, but he
Are
made
you
one
talking
purchase.
about the one that happened in 1987?
I'm talking about, no, the one just before he died.
Okay. Yeah, that is about 60 acres.
60. Okay. My memory tells me that that was about $55,000.
That tracks with my memory too.
Okay.
Property was holding pretty steady at about $1,000 an acre for undeveloped land for quite a long time, and it's really gone up in recent years. So we've seen a lot of change in the real estate market recently, as is reflected in the parcelization of the landscape out here. There's just lots more small parcels, and with every one of those small parcels comes its own road, its own fencing, its own well. In this neighborhood, generally its own single wide trailer and a few dead cars and maybe a pile of tires. Like that's kind of what happens out in this part of the world. And we've seen it happen to a lot of properties adjacent to us where they have been purchased and just trashed. And so we're just hanging on to as much of it as we can to hold off that kind of harm from the property. That's just what happens to land. I've seen it happen so many times that I can very confidently say that what happens to land in this neighborhood when Oconee does not buy it is it gets trashed. It either gets trashed or it's somebody's private hunting reserve. The hunters who own 20 acres out here adjacent to the state land, they're generally not trashing it too bad. They're just coming out and hunting, a few times a year. And I don't have any big objection to that. Don't really love the gunfire. And if they get into coming out to do target practice, that's not awesome. I'd sure rather it be held by conservation-oriented neighbors and friends of Oconee. But there's some pretty significant harm with the single wides and the RVs and the living in unpermitted structures and destroying the land. Oh, and ATVs. We got a lot of avid ATV drivers.
Right.
So as we're like looking to stock the neighborhood with friendly folks, this is part of what we're trying to hold off. And I mean, best case scenario is that Oconee is able to buy every property that comes up for sale adjacent to Oconee. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And in a world of limited resources, partnering with great neighbors is also a really great option. So these are two avenues that we're exploring pretty actively.
How many acres do you own now?
1,263.
Okay.
And we're adjacent to about roughly 1,000 acres of state land too, or of BLM land. So we are active stewards of that land as well, and have a pretty good and active relationship with the BLM thus far. We have a few more minutes for more questions, and I'm happy to stay on for maybe as long as 6:15 if people want to stay on, but I also want to respect people's time and let you hop off at 6 or hop off whenever you need to.
We're the neighbors, you know.
Um, we've got Bob and Jude. Did you
Yeah.
unmute?
I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. Let me see.
Hi, Shoni.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Judy.
So I'm looking at that map of behind where the hacienda where we used to live.
Yep.
Is that all, or can you say, is that all of Tim and MB's land and crossing Elsa Street Road and the piece on the other side? Is that all of what used to be Tim and well,
Let me pull up that map and I can share it. Let me see if I can get the technology to do that. There we are. So yes, so this is the hacienda where Bob and Judy lived for many, many years, and then my parents, Chris and Bob, lived. And then this was Tim and MB's homestead where they lived, and then this property is between their homestead and the hacienda. Ilsa Road comes up here. And then on the right side of Ilsa Road is this one that goes across what many of us as kids called the running field because we used to gallop horses up there. And then this one comes down further into the running field.
so is this all in Tim and MB's?
Yep. This
The
is
running-
all in Tim's estate.
All three of them,
All,
okay.
well, three of them, but not that one right there. Is that in it too?
Yep, all 4 of these properties.
All
Are
four
in
parcels.
Tim and MB's?
80 acres in total.
Oh, wow.
Okay,
And one has the straw bale and the well on it, right?
Yep.
that
Yeah.
had, okay.
And that's the only structure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Shoni.
Okay.
Of course.
Shoni, it looks
Okay.
like David had a question, and then there's a question in the chat.
Hi, Sharon.
Great.
Thank you. I had a question about hunting. Is there not, it sounds like you do not have a deer problem and do not require hunters to hunt on the land. The reason I'm asking is we just took a 40-day drive out east and visited land that Mary's grandparents put into a conservation easement between the Appalachian Trail and the Shenandoah Valley. And they have to work with hunters because they have such a deer problem. The hunters.
We do have a pretty large population of deer. We haven't actively encouraged hunting on Oconee land. We very occasionally will partner with a very respectful and carefully vetted hunter to cross Oconee land to go to hunt on the BLM land. And then we have a lot of neighbors who hunt and will hunt on the BLM land adjacent to us too. But we haven't been in a situation where we have really proactively encouraged hunting for population control. Michelle, I don't know, do you want to say more about that? I do know that some of the deer population has been a bit in trouble, and there's been some survey work that's been happening on Oconee land, and you might be able to speak to that more articulately than I can.
Yeah, probably not as well as I should be able to, but there is some kind of hemorrhagic disease that's going around the deer in this part of the world. We have mostly mule deer, and I think also some black-tailed deer, but mostly mule deer. This is a corner of the world where there is a lot of hunting that happens, managed by Washington Fish and Wildlife. And there's like a hefty an active hunting population happening here. They are managing that quite well, as far as our needs go. And yeah, they've been doing some surveying both to manage to get some data on the spread of the disease and also just to track their seasonal migration, because there just hasn't been a lot of information about where they're going and what they're doing. There's been a lot of theories. And it's been really interesting. Every once in a while, they will sometimes use our property and like some other large property owners as places to fly their helicopters to do their tracking and like to put their collars on the deer. And so they send out little reports and they're like, yeah, we learned this and it is really interesting, like where they're traveling. There's some deer that have like their totally own migration pattern. Like just like that one deer will go like its own way. And a lot of them are going like definitely across the Simcoes and down the Rock Creek watershed, like Shani was talking about. But yeah, I would say deer population management is not necessarily a focus of ours, but it is like something that is happening, and I'm grateful that someone is doing it.
Mhm. Oh, okay, and there's a question in the chat from Kim about whether we know what the Yakima plan for their nearby lands. We are deepening in partnership with the Yakima Nation. We were written in as a small participant in a federal grant through the America the Beautiful grant program. In partnership with the Yakima Nation and Columbia Land Trust to do some stewardship work on Oconee land. And there's a whole big scope of work on Yakima Nation land and on Columbia Land Trust land as part of that work. And it's been kind of tied up in bureaucracy for the past couple of years. And it sounds like we're finally cutting through some of the bureaucracy and getting that work moving. And so we will be learning so much more as we actually get that work moving and and fostering that partnership with the Yakima Nation as we go through that. It's one of the things we're really excited about. The land that they have in the lower section of Rock Creek, some of it is farmland, some of it is leased to farmers or ranchers for grazing, things like that. Some of it is around their longhouse, and I don't know that much about the stewardship priorities for that land. I do know that the Yakima Nation has a really strong priority on the fish populations in Rock Creek. So they're doing a lot of study of the fish populations and the genetics and the whether the steelhead are returning to Rock Creek and what the genetics of them are and where they're coming from, whether they're native Rock Creek fish or coming from other ecosystems like the Snake River. They did do some genetic inventorying of Rock Creek in the section of it that is owned by Oconee and identified a genetically distinct population of steelhead, which when they don't go to the ocean are known as rainbow trout, which is a thing that I learned from them, which is a fun thing to learn. So there's a genetically distinct population of rainbow trout that are landlocked steelhead living in the Oconee section of the creek, which is kind of cool that their genetics are not being intermingled with genetics from other creek ecosystems, as is happening to many other parts or the lower section of the Rock Creek and to many creek ecosystems, as more hatchery fish are infiltrating into watersheds. So those are a few
Shoni,
things that I learned from doing some fish surveying with Yakima
is there,
folks.
is there much public fishing on Rock Creek? Or is it closed?
I don't think that there's much public fishing. Well, there is that little reservoir at the very mouth of Rock Creek that I do think there's some public fishing in. But the upper parts of Rock Creek are very small. You know, it's a small creek. There's not like the fish that we see in the pools, like the mermaid pool and the pools on Oconee land. They're like this big. You know, they're real little. Nobody's going down there and getting dinner, or at
Okay.
least not a very big dinner.
Okay. And the fishing game is not, they haven't had any plans to plant fish in the drainage or any of the rest of that.
Not in the upper part of Rock Creek, and the lower part, I don't believe that they're stocking it in any kind of way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good questions. Any more? We do this presentation at the ranch sometimes, and it's way better at the ranch. We're just doing our best with Zoom. Thanks for bearing with us. Not our best medium, but I'm glad that we have the opportunity to connect with you all from all over the place on a December evening using this medium, even though it's not our native habitat. David, you unmuted?
It's a shorter drive.
We appreciate that. Having just driven all the way across the state this week in pretty snowy conditions, I can really appreciate the appeal of the shorter drive. Anything else before we hop off? Great. We do plan to do more Zooms like this throughout the year to help people stay connected to all of the different parts of our work. I expect that we'll do one about summer camp and one about the cemetery at some point to answer folks' questions about that. We may do one focused on horses at some point, and then we may like repeat them as well for people who couldn't make it to this one. And we will send out the recording at some point if folks are interested in seeing those maps again, or if anybody ever has questions about the maps or the land, or wants to talk in more detail about our conservation work or what the specifics of some of our current projects are. I'm always happy to have a convo, ideally over coffee or tea or whatever.
Okay.
Okay, then we're gonna hop off and look forward to seeing you in person before too long, I hope, or at another one of our Zooms. And between now and then, stay warm, stay well, have good holidays, and take good care. Thanks so much for coming over. It's really nice to see so many of your faces and names and hear from some of you and think of you thinking of Econyland too. Okay, good night.